Hey everyone, welcome to Dark Dossier. Before we dive into the video, comment your city down below. I wanna see where you're all tuning in from. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe so you never miss out. Let's get started. Story 1. The locksmith who accidentally robbed himself. You walk down a quiet street in a Midwestern town in the late 1980s. The kind of town where people don't lock their doors, or at least, they didn't until a string of curious burglaries began to unsettle the sense of safety. The man at the center of it was not an outsider, not a masked intruder slipping through shadows, but the very person entrusted with the community's security, the town's locksmith. This story begins with routine keys, replacement locks, and harmless chatter over counters. The locksmith, let's call him Henry, was known by nearly everyone. He repaired jammed doors, duplicated keys for forgetful neighbors, and even installed the first heavy-duty safes in the town's small businesses. He was dependable, quiet, and lived in a modest single-story house with his wife. To all appearances, Henry embodied stability. But beneath this quiet surface, his trade gave him something rare: unrestricted access. It started small: a set of duplicate keys forgotten on a workbench, a lock replacement where Henry kept the original cut. At first, it seemed more habit than scheme, the kind of over-preparation any craftsman might justify. Yet over time, the habit evolved into opportunity, and eventually, opportunity turned into crime. The first signs. The first victim didn't even realize a crime had occurred. A widow named Margaret reported that her late husband's coin collection had gone missing. She didn't think of it as theft, just misplaced. A few months later, another household discovered their emergency cash envelope was thinner than before. Police brushed it off as forgetfulness. The town wasn't used to burglary. Suspicion rarely lingered on neighbors, and never on Henry, the locksmith who sometimes checked their doors himself. By the early 1990s, however, patterns began to emerge. A strange commonality linked these quiet, nearly invisible thefts. They all involved locks Henry had worked on. Still, no one accused him. Who would? To suspect the locksmith meant suspecting trust itself. Henry had built that trust for decades. What no one realized was that he had also built a hidden ledger of every key he ever cut. A private archive that meant he could walk into nearly any building in town without forcing a lock, without a sound, without suspicion. A town on edge. It wasn't until the local pharmacy reported missing stock prescription painkillers in small but regular quantities that police began to take things seriously. Unlike cash or coins, missing controlled substances required federal reporting. The police started to ask sharper questions. How could someone break into a pharmacy without any sign of forced entry? The answer was clear to investigators: a key. That's when the circle of suspects narrowed to employees, cleaning staff, and service providers. Henry's name, for the first time, landed on a quiet list at the police station. Still, nothing tied him directly. Each time police examined the locks, Henry himself was often called in to check for tampering. The irony was exquisite. The very man they suspected was the one they trusted to confirm a break-in. And Henry always confirmed the same thing: no forced entry, no damaged locks, just mystery. Henry's decline. What makes this case more tragic than sensational is that Henry wasn't a master criminal or a calculating mastermind. He was drowning in debts, a failed expansion loan for his shop, mounting bills, and whispers of gambling at a nearby dog track. His thefts weren't about luxury, they were about survival. The pharmacist's missing pills were traced not to resale, but to Henry himself. He had begun to rely on them, first for back pain from years of labor, then for escape. Neighbors later recalled how he looked tired all the time, his hands shaking when cutting a key. His own business began to falter, customers drifting away without knowing why. And yet, he kept stealing, kept unlocking doors that weren't his. The break in his alibi. The turning point came when a small insurance office was burglarized. The intruder left quietly, taking only records, not cash. Investigators were baffled until they realized those records pertained to debts owed by several townsfolk, including Henry himself. Suddenly, the theft looked less random and more personal. The police began quiet surveillance. They noted Henry's comings and goings, the odd hours, the customers who never saw him at the shop when he was supposed to be there. Still, without physical proof, they couldn't move forward. Then, a young patrol officer made a discovery. Henry had a second workshop hidden in his garage, where he duplicated keys without logging them. Inside drawers were dozens of blank cuts, some labeled with initials matching burglary victims. It wasn't enough for conviction yet, but it was a crack in the facade. The unanswered question. At this stage, the story reaches a haunting pause. Henry was the locksmith who built the town's security, yet he quietly dismantled it from within. Every lock became an open door, every neighbor's trust became leverage. The police were closing in, but Henry's quiet efficiency made it hard to catch him red-handed. And so the unresolved question lingers. Would the locksmith eventually expose himself through carelessness? Or would the town's trust protect him long enough for his secret life to collapse on its own? You can picture Henry in those last months before his secret unraveled, tired, wary, yet strangely confident in the power of silence. For years, he had slipped unnoticed through homes and businesses, using the very locks he sold to others as a disguise for his own thefts. But crime, even quiet crime, leaves ripples. And soon those ripples began to overlap in ways Henry couldn't control. The growing pattern. The pharmacy thefts had raised alarm, but what truly caught the attention of investigators was their irregularity. Burglars usually strike for maximum gain, quick cash, valuables, or drugs that can be sold for profit. Henry's thefts, however, looked almost hesitant. A few bottles here, an envelope there, a collection missing only a handful of coins rather than the whole set. To detectives, the pattern suggested someone who wasn't driven by greed alone, but by need someone close enough to the victims to know what could disappear without immediate notice. This wasn't a classic burglar. This was someone trusted. And trust narrowed the pool of suspects dramatically. Police began closing in. Detectives quietly placed Henry under discreet watch. They didn't confront him, not yet. Instead, they began to map his movements against the timeline of thefts. They noticed how often he offered to help out when businesses or homes reported strange goings-on. It was subtle, but the overlap was damning. They also checked his financials. The locksmith's shop, once reliable, was failing. Records showed loans in arrears, unpaid supplier invoices, and even a repossessed work van. His personal accounts were worse. Gambling withdrawals at the local track, payday loans, and small, desperate deposits that didn't line up with his official income. But police needed more than suspicion. They needed a break, a mistake Henry couldn't undo. The locksmith's fatal error. That break came in the form of a safe. A local hardware store reported missing cash from its nightly deposits, though the safe showed no signs of forced entry. It looked like money had simply walked away. When investigators checked the lock, they realized the safe had been serviced by Henry just months before. What Henry didn't know was that this particular safe had a serial mechanism that logged every time it was opened. The store owner, frustrated by losses, had insisted on the model. When police pulled the log, it revealed something extraordinary. The safe had been opened at 2:37 a.m. on a Tuesday, a time when no one in the store should have had access. Only one person had a key and a knowledge of that lock's quirks: Henry. The sting operation. Rather than arrest him immediately, detectives chose patience. They set up a sting. Working with a cooperative shop owner, they asked Henry to service another lock, knowing full well they would secretly mark and track any duplicate keys he might make. As expected, Henry kept a copy. Days later, the shop was broken into with no signs of forced entry. This time, however, investigators were waiting. They had planted a hidden camera inside, capturing a figure entering smoothly with a key, rifling through the till, and leaving as if nothing had happened. When police confronted Henry with the footage, he denied it was him. But the grainy image showed details only locals would recognize: the slope of his shoulders, the distinctive work boots he always wore, and the jingling chain of keys at his belt. It was enough for an arrest. Community reaction. The town's reaction was less outrage than disbelief. Neighbors spoke of their shock in tones usually reserved for sudden illness or tragic accidents. Henry, the locksmith, the man who had opened their doors when they were locked out, who had fixed broken latches for free, who had given advice on home safety. What unsettled people most wasn't the theft itself, but the betrayal. It wasn't that valuables were stolen, it was that their sense of security had been quietly dismantled. A lock no longer felt like a promise. If the locksmith could walk into your home at will, what protection did you truly have? For months after his arrest, residents changed their locks en masse, often hearing out-of-town services. Some even replaced doors entirely, convinced Henry had compromised them. The irony was bitter. The man who had once made them feel safe had made them fear their own locks. Inside the interrogation room, police questioned Henry for hours. At first, he maintained his innocence, claiming the video was misleading, the financial troubles exaggerated, and the missing keys merely sloppy bookkeeping. But slowly, cracks appeared. Investigators confronted him with evidence of the safe logs, the duplicate keys, and the testimony of victims whose homes he had serviced just before valuables went missing. Henry began to falter. He admitted to borrowing items, but claimed he had always intended to return them. He insisted it wasn't theft, just desperation. Yet the evidence stacked too high. Detectives pressed him on the pharmacy thefts, the insurance records, the gambling. Each time he tried to minimize his role, the details betrayed him. By the end, he sat slumped, exhausted, muttering that he never meant to hurt anyone. What haunted officers most was his quiet admission: "I thought if I only took a little, no one would ever notice." Courtroom drama. When Henry's case went to trial, it lacked the fireworks of high-profile crimes. No dramatic chases, no bloody evidence. Instead, it was paperwork, timestamps, key logs, and testimony. But in its quiet way, the trial revealed something profound: how deeply crime can intertwine with ordinary trust. The prosecution painted Henry as a man who had exploited his position, systematically betraying neighbors and clients. They emphasized his financial motives, his gambling debts, and his addiction to painkillers. The defense countered with a portrait of a hardworking man crushed by circumstances, who made mistakes out of desperation rather than malice. Witnesses took the stand, some reluctant, some angry. One widow spoke tearfully about how her late husband's coin collection, carefully preserved for decades, had vanished piece by piece. A pharmacist described the missing medications that could have endangered lives. The hardware store owner recounted the eerie realization that his safe had been quietly opened at night. The jury deliberated less on whether Henry had committed the crimes. The evidence was clear, and more on how far-reaching his betrayal truly was. The cliffhanger. As the trial neared its conclusion, the question was no longer whether Henry was guilty, but how severe his punishment would be. Would the court see him as a cunning manipulator who dismantled an entire town's trust, or as a broken man whose addictions and debts pushed him into quiet theft? The sentencing loomed. Neighbors wondered whether the locksmith who had once held the keys to their homes would now find himself behind a door he could never unlock. And yet, one unresolved matter remained. The police believed not all the stolen items had been recovered. Coins, cash, and documents were missing, and Henry refused to say where they were. So the haunting question lingered: had the locksmith hidden away pieces of his thefts, caches still waiting to be discovered? Or had he robbed himself as thoroughly as he robbed others, leaving nothing behind but broken trust? You're sitting in a quiet courtroom on the day of sentencing. The air feels heavier than the sum of the charges: burglary, unlawful entry, possession of controlled substances, and fraud. The townspeople fill the benches, not because the crime was sensational, but because it was personal. Each lock in town had been touched by Henry's hands. Each stolen item was less about monetary loss and more about the slow erosion of safety. The locksmith had robbed more than safes and tills. He had robbed a community of its sense of security. The sentence. When the judge finally spoke, it wasn't with anger but with a calm weariness that seemed to mirror the town itself. Henry was sentenced to 7 years in state prison, with eligibility for parole in 4. The ruling took into account his lack of violent behavior, but also the sheer scale of his betrayal. The defense had argued for leniency, citing his gambling debts, painkiller dependency, and financial struggles. But the prosecution's framing had cut deeper. Henry was a tradesman trusted with the most private parts of people's lives, and he used that access to quietly exploit them. The judge's words lingered in the courtroom. "You didn't just break into homes, Mr. Thompson. You broke into trust, and trust is the hardest lock of all to repair." Aftermath in the community. In the weeks after sentencing, locksmith vans from neighboring towns began to appear on quiet streets. Residents replaced locks, safes, even doors. Some went as far as installing alarm systems, a rare sight in such a small community before. But beyond the physical changes, something subtler shifted. The town grew more cautious, more suspicious. Where once people had left doors unlocked while visiting neighbors, they now checked and double-checked bolts. Conversations about trust became awkward, peppered with "you never know anymore" and "better safe than sorry." Henry's fall had altered something foundational. The locksmith who once symbolized security had left behind a void that no deadbolt could fill. The search for missing valuables. Police continued to look for the stolen items Henry never accounted for. Some coins resurfaced when pawnshops in nearby cities reported them. A few pieces of jewelry, long missing, appeared at second-hand stores, but much of it was never recovered. When pressed, Henry gave conflicting stories. Sometimes he said he had lost them gambling. Other times he claimed he had hidden them for later. Yet he never disclosed where. Even after sentencing, he seemed to take strange pride in keeping that part of his crime unresolved, as though holding on to one final secret gave him some measure of control. Rumors spread in town of buried stashes, coins sealed in jars, envelopes hidden in hollow walls, ledgers tucked beneath floorboards. Some people even tore apart old safes, convinced Henry had planted something inside. Whether true or not, the mystery added another layer of unease. Life behind bars. Henry adjusted poorly to prison. Accustomed to working with his hands, he struggled with the monotony of confinement. He applied to work in the prison's maintenance shop, repairing locks and doors, a bitter irony not lost on guards who joked about the locksmith in chains. Inmates often asked him for advice on breaking into cars or safes, assuming his trade had made him a master criminal. But Henry was no expert in cracking locks. He simply had access. Without his position of trust, he was ordinary, even vulnerable. Letters from his wife dwindled until they stopped altogether. Friends distanced themselves, unwilling to be associated with the man whose name had become synonymous with betrayal. For the first time, Henry was truly locked out of the community he had once served. The town moves on. By the time Henry was eligible for parole, much had changed. The locksmith shop had closed permanently, replaced by a bakery. Younger residents barely remembered the string of thefts, though older ones still spoke of that time when trust was broken. Some even admitted that Henry's crimes had inadvertently improved their awareness of security. Businesses adopted better safes, households installed sturdier locks, and the police developed stricter protocols for service providers. The locksmith's betrayal had forced the community to think critically about something they had once taken for granted. Still, scars lingered. When asked years later about the case, one resident summed it up quietly. "It wasn't the money. It was knowing the man we trusted most was the one who hurt us." Reflection. What makes Henry's story resonate isn't its scale. He wasn't a master thief or a violent criminal. It's the ordinariness of it all. A small-town locksmith, drowning in debts and addictions, slowly unraveled by his own access. The crimes were mundane in detail but extraordinary in impact. In a way, Henry truly did rob himself. His trade, his reputation, his community all gone, not in one dramatic moment but through years of small, almost invisible thefts. The locksmith who once held every key in town ended up behind a lock he could never pick. The last unresolved question. And yet the question remains. Where did it all go? What happened to the missing valuables that never surfaced? Were they lost forever to gambling tables, or do they still sit in some hidden cache, forgotten until someone stumbles upon them decades later? Perhaps that mystery is fitting. The locksmith's crime was never about spectacle. It was about the quiet erosion of trust, the kind of crime that leaves behind not headlines but whispers. And whispers, like missing coins and unmarked keys, have a way of lingering long after the doors have been locked again. Story 2. The postman who stole his own letters. Imagine the quiet sound of letters sliding through a slot, the dependable rhythm of footsteps on a front porch, the simple comfort of knowing the mail will arrive. For generations, the postman has been one of the most trusted figures in any community. The uniform, the satchel, the familiar wave down the street, all symbols of reliability. But in the early 2000s, in a small town tucked away in rural Pennsylvania, that trust was quietly dismantled. It wasn't stolen by an outsider or a clever thief breaking into mailboxes at night. It was stolen by the very man delivering the mail. This is the story of Richard "Rick" Mallory, a postal worker who didn't just betray his community by pilfering their letters, he betrayed himself, unraveling his life through a crime that was both shockingly simple and devastatingly personal. A trusted figure. Rick had been a postal worker for over 15 years. He wasn't particularly ambitious, nor was he known for being lazy. He was, in the eyes of his coworkers, steady. He walked the same routes day after day, rain or shine, and became part of the fabric of the neighborhoods he served. People recognized him. Children waved at him. Elderly residents sometimes left him cookies or bottles of water. He wasn't just the mailman, he was part of the routine, the rhythm of life. And routine, as it so often does, hid the cracks forming beneath. The first temptation. It began small. Rick was sorting letters in his truck one morning when he noticed an envelope with bold lettering, "Payment enclosed." It was from a local resident, addressed to a credit card company. The envelope felt thick, heavier than usual. Something stirred. He didn't act on it immediately, but the thought lingered as he walked his route. What if just once he opened it? The first time he slipped a letter into his jacket pocket, it wasn't about greed. It was about desperation. Rick was drowning in credit card debt. His marriage had collapsed under financial strain, and he was behind on child support. He felt cornered, invisible in his struggles. That first stolen envelope contained $200 in cash payment meant to cover someone else's bill. Rick used it to cover his own. A growing habit. From there, the line blurred. Once he realized how simple it was, how easy it was to pocket a few envelopes without anyone noticing, the temptation became routine. He began to look for specific clues, bold lettering like "Payment enclosed," greeting cards that might contain cash, and small packages that could hold valuables. The thefts were strategic, never excessive. He didn't take every tempting envelope, just enough to avoid raising suspicion. A birthday card here, a bill payment there. To the victims, the losses felt like mistakes of the postal system, lost in transit, delayed in sorting, perhaps misplaced in a distant processing center. Few thought to blame the man who greeted them every day with a polite nod. But like all patterns of theft, it grew. What began as an occasional act soon became daily habit. The invisible victims. What makes this story haunting isn't just the theft, but the ripple effect it created. Bill payments never reached their destinations. Credit card companies marked accounts delinquent. Utility shut-off warnings arrived for households who swore they had paid. Birthday cards to grandchildren went missing, leaving families hurt and confused. For months, people in town complained about the mail service. The local post office fielded calls about delays, lost letters, and missing payments. Some residents even accused the sorting facility in a nearby city of incompetence. Nobody suspected Rick. After all, who would accuse the smiling postman with the well-worn satchel? The slip. The unraveling began with something Rick never anticipated: routine checks by the U.S. Postal Inspection Service. The Inspection Service, one of the oldest federal law enforcement agencies in the country, investigates crimes involving the mail. Complaints had been piling up in Rick's delivery zone, and patterns suggested more than just random misplacement. Inspectors planted test letters, envelopes designed to look like real payments, some containing marked bills, others with tiny tracking devices. They were placed deliberately along Rick's route. Within days, some of those letters failed to reach their destinations. Rick had pocketed them. Surveillance. The inspectors moved quickly. Rick's route was discreetly surveilled, his truck monitored. Cameras hidden in nearby mailboxes caught him sliding letters into his jacket. His home trash was examined, revealing torn envelopes and discarded payment slips. One day, inspectors intercepted him at the end of his shift. They searched his satchel and found multiple letters that should have been delivered, including one of their test envelopes with marked cash. When confronted, Rick didn't protest. He slumped in his seat and admitted what he had done. He claimed it had gotten out of control, that he just needed the money, and that he never thought it would cause so much harm. The community's reaction. News of his arrest spread fast. For residents, the betrayal felt intimate. This wasn't an unknown thief breaking into cars or homes, it was the man who carried their bills, their letters to loved ones, their checks, their secrets. Some residents felt violated, as though their private words and payments had been spied upon. Others felt foolish for ever trusting him. Rick's coworkers were equally stunned. Many had worked alongside him for years, never suspecting a thing. He was quiet, dependable, one said. If you asked me who'd do something like that, he'd be the last person on the list. The story made local papers, not because of the money involved, which was relatively small compared to major theft cases, but because of what it represented. The breach of trust was worth more than any dollar amount. The unresolved question. As inspectors cataloged Rick's thefts, one mystery lingered. How many letters had he stolen, really? Victims could only report missing mail they knew about, payments they thought had been delivered, cards they believed were simply delayed, packages they assumed were lost. Many would never be traced back to Rick. Even Rick himself admitted he had lost track. Dozens, maybe hundreds, he told investigators. I didn't keep count, I just kept going. You can picture Rick Mallory sitting across from federal postal inspectors in a windowless interrogation room. His blue uniform shirt, still neatly pressed, is now evidence of betrayal. The inspectors speak calmly, asking him to account for what they already know. Rick's voice, weary and resigned, reveals the truth. The thefts weren't isolated incidents. They had been going on for years. A systematic theft. The U.S. Postal Inspection Service began compiling a timeline of Rick's thefts. What emerged was staggering. By their estimates, he had stolen or tampered with mail at least 3 to 4 times per week for nearly 5 years. Some weeks, he pocketed nothing. Others, he took multiple envelopes in a single shift. The thefts ranged from small amounts of cash, $20 slipped inside a birthday card, to larger sums intended for bill payments. Occasionally, he even intercepted checks, though cashing them carried greater risk. Inspectors believed he had destroyed many of the checks after realizing he couldn't use them. The problem was not only the money. Each stolen envelope represented a disruption in someone's life: late fees, strained relationships, missed opportunities, a grandmother's birthday card that never arrived, a mortgage payment that triggered a warning letter, a college application fee that vanished in the system. The emotional toll stretched far beyond the financial. Motivation and decline. Rick's motivations were depressingly ordinary. His gambling addiction had hollowed out his finances. What began as weekend trips to the racetrack became daily wagers, often using money he didn't have. His divorce had left him with child support obligations he struggled to meet, and his own pride prevented him from asking for help. "I thought I could fix it," he told inspectors during questioning. "Just a little here and there, enough to get me through, but then it was never enough." His thefts weren't born from thrill-seeking or elaborate planning. They were the desperate actions of a man who saw opportunity in the envelopes he carried each day. The same envelopes that symbolized trust to his community became, for him, a lifeline and ultimately, a noose. Building the case. Federal prosecutors took over. Rick was charged with mail theft, a federal offense under Title 18 of the United States Code. While his crimes weren't violent, they carried serious weight. Tampering with the mail system threatened the integrity of one of the oldest and most trusted institutions in the country. The prosecution built their case meticulously. They presented video surveillance, marked test letters recovered from Rick's possession, and stacks of complaints from residents. They introduced the testimony of victims who described the real consequences of his thefts: damaged credit scores, family disputes, and even lost jobs due to missed communications. The defense attempted to frame Rick's actions as the tragic spiral of a man overwhelmed by addiction and financial hardship. They argued for treatment, for leniency, for recognition that he hadn't stolen thousands or orchestrated large-scale fraud. But the prosecutors countered that the crime wasn't measured in dollars, it was measured in trust. The trial atmosphere. When Rick's case went to court, the courtroom filled with familiar faces. Neighbors, friends, and victims attended, many out of curiosity, others out of a desire for closure. The sight of Rick in a federal courtroom, dressed in a plain suit instead of his uniform, unsettled them. He looked smaller, older, stripped of the quiet authority his mail satchel once gave him. Witnesses recounted their frustrations and their shock. One elderly woman described how she had mailed birthday cards to her grandson every year and how 2 years in a row they had never arrived. "I thought the boy didn't care enough to say thank you," she said softly. "Turns out he never got them." Another man described the domino effect of a missed mortgage payment. A late fee, a credit ding, and months of frustration spent trying to clear his record with the bank. All because his payment had been stolen on Rick's route. The testimony painted a picture not of one man's theft, but of dozens of private hardships caused by his decisions. Rick's silence. Throughout much of the trial, Rick remained quiet. He admitted guilt, but he rarely elaborated. When given the chance to speak, he told the court, "I never meant to hurt anyone, I just thought I could get by. But I see now that every letter meant something to someone, and I stole more than money. I stole peace of mind." His words didn't come across as rehearsed. They were tired, almost broken, the voice of a man who finally saw the enormity of what he had done. Sentencing looms. The question then became, how should the court weigh his crimes? Federal guidelines suggested several years in prison, though Rick's lack of prior convictions and his cooperation could reduce the sentence. The prosecution pushed for firm punishment, emphasizing the need to deter others. The defense argued for treatment and probation, suggesting prison would only deepen his despair. The town waited anxiously. For many, the sentence wasn't about Rick as an individual. It was about sending a message that trust, once broken, carried consequences. The hidden mystery. As the trial drew towards sentencing, inspectors revealed one more troubling detail. The total number of stolen letters could never be determined. For every test envelope caught in Rick's hands, countless others might have disappeared without record. Some families believed Rick had intercepted their mail years earlier. A few claimed they had mailed checks that mysteriously never cleared, long before complaints reached the inspection service. The possibility suggested a larger, unseen history of theft. Rick himself admitted he didn't remember. "It all blurred together," he said in one interview. "At first I could tell you every letter, every dollar, but after a while I stopped keeping track. It was just part of the job." The ambiguity left a permanent hole in the case. No one would ever know how many letters Rick had really stolen, how many moments of connection had been lost forever. The cliffhanger. On the day of sentencing, the courtroom filled once more. The judge's decision would not only determine Rick's fate, but also signal how seriously the justice system weighed betrayal of trust within the postal service. Would Rick be sent to prison for years, a warning to others who might abuse their roots? Or would the court see him as a broken man who needed treatment more than punishment? The tension in the room was thick. Residents leaned forward in their seats, waiting for the ruling. You're seated once again in the courthouse, the low hum of whispered conversations filling the air. Everyone has gathered for the conclusion of a case that seemed almost unthinkable, a postman stealing the very letters he was trusted to deliver. On this day, Richard "Rick" Mallory would learn his fate. The prosecutor sits stiffly, a thick binder of evidence on the table before her. The defense attorney leans closer to Rick, whispering last-minute reassurances. Rick himself looks tired, his eyes downcast, his hands folded tightly in his lap. In the gallery, neighbors and victims wait with a mix of curiosity, anger, and sadness. The judge enters and silence falls. The sentence. The judge begins by acknowledging the unusual nature of the case. There were no violent acts, no massive financial embezzlement, no elaborate schemes. And yet, the weight of the crime was profound. The theft of mail, the judge noted, was not simply theft of property, it was a theft of trust, a betrayal of an institution woven into the daily lives of Americans. Rick Mallory was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised release. He was also ordered to pay restitution, though the exact amount was symbolic. Investigators could never fully account for the true extent of his thefts. The courtroom was hushed. Some residents felt the sentence was too light, that Rick had caused damage far greater than 2.5 years behind bars could balance. Others quietly acknowledged that prison, addiction treatment, and permanent loss of his career were punishment enough. For Rick, the decision was devastating but not unexpected. He nodded faintly as the sentence was read, as though he had rehearsed this moment in his mind 1,000 times. Life behind bars. Prison life stripped away the quiet dignity Rick once carried on his route. Gone was the satchel, the uniform, the smile that greeted neighbors. Inside, he was just another inmate, identified by a number instead of a name. Ironically, some fellow prisoners regarded him with a kind of amused contempt. The mailman, they called him. Unlike those who had committed violent crimes, Rick's offense seemed almost laughably small in their eyes. But to him, it was anything but small. He spent much of his time in prison programs, addiction counseling, financial responsibility courses, and vocational workshops. Counselors noted his tendency toward self-blame, his inability to forgive himself for what he had done. One remarked, "He carries guilt like a second skin. It's not just about the money. It's about the fact that he took people's trust, and he doesn't know how to live with that." The community aftermath. Back in town, Life moved forward, but the shadow of the case lingered. Residents became more cautious with their mail. Some stopped sending cash in birthday cards altogether. Others switched to online bill payments, no longer trusting envelopes to carry their most important obligations. The local post office struggled with its image. Though Rick was gone, complaints still trickled in from residents who swore letters had disappeared, some genuine mistakes, others perhaps fueled by paranoia. The trust that had once been automatic now felt fragile. For years afterward, conversations at neighborhood gatherings would sometimes circle back to the story. Remember when the mailman was caught? It became a kind of cautionary tale, proof that even the most ordinary figures could quietly unravel. Rick's release. When Rick was released from prison, he returned to a world that no longer had a place for him in the postal service. He had lost his pension, his job, and his reputation. Few employers were willing to take on a man with a federal conviction tied so directly to trust. He took odd jobs: construction, warehouse shifts, anything that kept him afloat. But his name remained connected to the theft. Some neighbors avoided him in the grocery store, unwilling to make eye contact. Others spoke to him kindly, but with a hesitation that hadn't been there before. Rick himself rarely spoke of his crimes. In one interview given years later, he admitted, "I didn't just lose a job, I lost who I was. Being a mailman was the one thing I did right, and I ruined it. Every time I see a letterbox, I think of what I took away." The larger lessons. The case of Rick Mallory is small compared to the grand scale of crime. The amounts stolen were minor. No lives were lost. No national headlines blared his name. And yet, it remains haunting because of what it represents. We trust ordinary people every day: the bus driver, the pharmacist, the bank clerk, the postman. Their roles depend on the assumption of reliability, the quiet faith that they will do what they're supposed to do. When that faith is broken, even in small ways, it shakes us more than dramatic crimes ever could. Rick's story is a reminder of how fragile trust can be, how it can collapse not with a bang, but with the soft rustle of an envelope slipping into the wrong pocket. The final reflection. In the end, Rick Mallory didn't just steal from his neighbors. He stole from himself: his identity, his livelihood, his standing in the community. Every letter he pocketed was another piece of his own downfall. And yet, one question lingers. How many stories were lost in the letters that never arrived? How many apologies never reached their destination? How many words of love? How many payments that meant relief instead caused harm? We may never know. Perhaps that's the most haunting part. Not the prison sentence, not the stolen cash, but the vanished moments, conversations erased before they ever began. Story 3. The small-town bank teller who balanced books with lies. The story begins in a bank that looks like countless others in small American towns. A modest brick building with a flagpole out front, a row of teller windows inside, and the faint hum of fluorescent lights above. It's the kind of bank where the staff know the customers by name, where handwritten deposit slips still stack neatly on counters, and where trust seems as solid as the vault in the back. In that setting, Janice Howell, a long-serving bank teller, built her reputation. She was polite, efficient, and meticulous. Customers appreciated her calm demeanor, and her managers valued her consistency. She worked in the same chair for more than 20 years, processing thousands of transactions, never raising suspicion. But behind the neat stacks of ledgers and the smile at the counter, Janice was building something else: a hidden web of lies that quietly siphoned money from the very people who trusted her most. The perfect position. Tellers hold a peculiar place of power. They handle deposits, withdrawals, and the fine details of customer accounts. While banks have layers of oversight, much of that oversight assumes the honesty of frontline staff. In a small-town branch with limited staff, those assumptions become even stronger. Janice knew the systems better than most. She understood how checks were processed, how deposit slips were logged, and how balancing the books at the end of each day depended on careful reconciliation. She also knew where the blind spots were, the small discrepancies that could be explained away as clerical errors, the delays in reconciling accounts that provided breathing room. For years, she remained honest, but financial stress has a way of testing integrity. The first lie. Janice's slide into fraud began with something almost invisible, a $50 adjustment on a deposit. A local customer had brought in cash, but Janice reported $450 instead of $500. She pocketed the difference, telling herself it was temporary, that she'd fix it later. When the books balanced at the end of the day, no one questioned it. Small discrepancies were often chalked up to counting errors, and Janice's reputation as a careful teller shielded her from suspicion. But once she realized how easy it was, the line blurred. $50 became $100. $100 became $200. Each time she promised herself it was the last. Each time she found herself deeper in need. Mounting pressures. Her motives weren't extravagant. Janice wasn't buying luxury cars or taking exotic vacations. She was paying off medical bills for her husband, covering debts from a failed small business, and trying to keep her household afloat. In her mind, she wasn't stealing, she was borrowing. But borrowing requires repayment, and repayment never came. Instead, the gaps widened. When customers noticed missing funds, she quietly reassured them, "It's probably a clerical error, I'll check the system." Often, she corrected the records later, using money taken from another account to cover the first. It was a delicate balancing act, shifting funds around to cover the gaps she created. This method, robbing Peter to pay Paul, is known as lapping. It's one of the oldest forms of embezzlement in banking, and Janice had reinvented it without ever learning its name. The web expands. Over time, Janice's scheme grew increasingly complex. She developed a quiet system, targeting elderly customers who rarely checked their balances. Skimming from business deposits, confident the owners would blame bookkeeping errors rather than theft. Using cash transactions to mask her adjustments, knowing paper trails were weaker. She became skilled at shifting funds, always staying just ahead of discovery. If a customer complained, she moved money from another account to correct the discrepancy, leaving the appearance of a resolved error. Her managers, seeing her diligence in addressing mistakes, praised her for catching errors others might miss. The irony was bitter. The very fraud she created made her look like one of the bank's most reliable employees. The first suspicion. The cracks began to show after nearly a decade of manipulation. A regional auditor conducting a routine review noticed a strange pattern. Janice's drawer balanced perfectly almost every day. Too perfectly. Most tellers had small discrepancies, $1 over here, $5 short there. But Janice's books were immaculate. At first glance, it seemed like evidence of her precision. But to an experienced auditor, it raised suspicion. Real life is messy. Perfection can signal manipulation. The auditor flagged her account activity for deeper review. Customers speak up. Around the same time, a few customers began to grow uneasy. One elderly man claimed his savings account balance looked lighter than it should be. A small business owner reported that deposits didn't always match his own books. Each time, Janice smoothed things over with reassurances and quick adjustments. But the complaints, though small, accumulated. And when management compared them to the auditor's notes, a troubling picture began to form. The trap is set. Bank investigators decided to watch Janice more closely. They introduced surprise cash counts, cross-checks of her transactions, and deeper analysis of accounts she handled most frequently. They also planted test deposits, designed to see if she would tamper with them. For weeks, Janice carried on as usual, unaware of the scrutiny. But the pressure of constant balancing had taken its toll. Her system was stretched thin, her lapping harder to maintain as more complaints surfaced. She began making small mistakes, forgetting to cover a gap, miscalculating a shift of funds. Those mistakes became the breadcrumbs investigators needed. The unresolved question. By the time suspicions crystallized, Janice was living in a state of quiet panic. Every day was a gamble. Could she balance the books one more time, hide the gaps for one more shift, keep the house of cards standing? The auditors had begun to circle. Customers were whispering about missing money, and the bank itself was preparing to confront her. The unresolved question hangs. Would Janice confess before the web collapsed around her, or would investigators catch her red-handed in the act of deception? Picture Janice Howell sitting at her teller station, carefully counting bills with steady hands, her smile as calm as ever. To customers, she was the picture of composure. But inside, panic pulsed through her veins. Every keystroke, every cash count, every deposit she touched was part of a fragile game she could no longer control. The net was tightening around her, though she didn't yet know how quickly. The investigation deepens. When auditors first flagged Janice's suspiciously perfect balancing, her supervisors decided to dig deeper. They quietly compared her work with other tellers, reviewing months of transactions. The pattern became clear: irregular deposits, adjustments that always seemed to correct themselves, and customer complaints that coincidentally linked back to her drawer. Bank investigators set up surprise audits, appearing without warning to count her drawer mid-shift. Janice, ever calm, always managed to balance the numbers. But the closer they looked, the more inconsistencies appeared in the broader accounts. The investigators knew one thing: Janice wasn't sloppy. She was precise, which meant the errors weren't random. They were deliberate. The strain of lapping. Janice's lapping scheme was growing too tangled to sustain. She was using new deposits to cover old thefts, shuffling funds like a street hustler moving cups in a shell game. But unlike a street corner con, her victims were neighbors and friends. She knew their faces, their families, their stories. Each time she moved money from one account to another, she told herself it was temporary, that she'd fix it before anyone noticed. Yet fixing one account meant damaging another. The cycle had become endless, and the numbers no longer lined up cleanly. Some days she stayed late, staring at ledgers, inventing explanations for discrepancies. Other days she left early, praying no one would notice the gaps. The emotional toll was immense. She lost weight, developed migraines, and avoided eye contact with her managers. But outwardly she remained composed, the friendly teller, the meticulous worker, the face of the bank. The customers pushed back. By now, customers were complaining more forcefully. The elderly man who had first suspected missing funds returned, this time with his daughter, who pressed harder. "My father knows how much he deposited. Are you saying he's lying?" Janice smiled, reassured them, and promised to investigate. Behind the counter, her heart raced. She couldn't afford to cover the gap this time. Too many other accounts were already patched with borrowed funds. The small business owner, too, raised louder concerns. "I make my deposits at the same time every Friday. Why do my statements keep showing errors?" His frustration was noted in writing by the bank manager, adding to the file now quietly building against Janice. The bank's strategy. Rather than confront her directly, the bank chose patience. They installed covert surveillance cameras near her workstation, capturing her daily routines. They reviewed her computer activity, tracing logins and edits to accounts. They set up controlled deposits with marked bills, watching to see if they disappeared. Within weeks, they had evidence. On camera, Janice was seen pocketing small amounts of cash before balancing her drawer. On the system logs, her ID number appeared on suspicious adjustments. And the marked bills, they showed up in her personal account, deposited at an ATM in a neighboring town. The evidence was damning. The confrontation. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Janice arrived as usual, her hair neatly pinned back, her ledger ready. She greeted her coworkers with her usual calm, then sat at her station. Moments later, the branch manager approached with two auditors and a security officer. "Janice, we need to speak with you in the office." Her hands froze mid-count. She glanced up, her eyes flickering between faces. For a split second, she considered denying everything. But as she rose from her chair, she knew the game was over. Inside the manager's office, the auditors laid out the evidence. The videos, the logs, the marked bills. They asked her to explain. At first, she insisted it was all mistakes, misunderstandings, the kind of clerical errors that happen in any bank. But as they pressed, her composure cracked. She admitted to borrowing small amounts to cover personal expenses. She insisted she had always meant to pay it back. But by then, the damage was irreversible. The emotional fallout. Word of her removal spread through the branch before the day ended. Customers who had trusted her for decades were stunned. "Janice," they whispered. "No, not her. She was always so kind." Coworkers felt betrayed. Some admitted they had admired her for years, never once questioning her integrity. Others confessed they had noticed her stress but assumed it was personal, not professional. For the community, it wasn't just a financial crime. It was the betrayal of someone they knew, someone who had smiled at them through the glass, someone they believed had safeguarded their money. The legal path. The bank pressed charges, and federal investigators took over. Embezzlement and fraud are serious crimes, particularly when they involve financial institutions. Prosecutors began building their case, gathering testimony from customers, coworkers, and auditors. The question wasn't whether Janice had stolen, the evidence was overwhelming. The real question was, how much had she taken, and over how many years? The auditors estimated the total losses at more than $200,000 spread over a decade. For a small-town bank, it was devastating. For the customers, it was life-altering. Some never recovered the funds. Others faced years of financial consequences from the gaps in their accounts. The cliffhanger. As Janice prepared for trial, she faced the collapse of everything she had built. Her career, her reputation, and the trust of an entire town. The prosecution painted her as a manipulator who exploited her position for personal gain. The defense framed her as a desperate woman cornered by medical bills and financial ruin. And so the unresolved question lingered. Would the court see her as a criminal who betrayed hundreds of people, or as a broken figure who stumbled into crime out of desperation? The sentencing loomed, and with it, the final unraveling of Janice Howell's carefully balanced lies. The courtroom was hushed when Janice Howell appeared for sentencing. Gone was the crisp bank uniform and the calm demeanor behind the teller's glass. She wore a plain blouse, her hands clasped tightly together, her gaze fixed on the floor. The woman who had once balanced the books of a community bank now stood accused of dismantling trust one transaction at a time. The trial. The prosecution laid out the evidence in excruciating detail. Video surveillance of Janice slipping marked bills from her drawer. System logs showing account manipulations tied directly to her login. Customer testimony describing missing funds and unexplained discrepancies. Auditor reports charting years of irregularities, totaling nearly $200,000 in losses. They painted Janice as deliberate and calculating, not a desperate woman making a one-time mistake, but a professional who orchestrated a decade-long fraud. The defense tried to soften her image. They described her as a loyal employee overwhelmed by medical bills, struggling to care for a husband with chronic illness. They argued she had intended to pay the money back, that she was not greedy, only desperate. But intent mattered less than impact. The victims were real: retirees who lost savings, small business owners who faced overdraft fees, families whose finances were thrown into turmoil. Janice speaks. When given the chance to speak, Janice's voice was barely audible. She admitted what she had done, though she still clung to the word borrowing. "I thought I could manage it. I thought I could put it back before anyone noticed. I never meant to hurt anyone. But I see now that every dollar I took was someone's trust, and I can't replace that." Her words, though quiet, carried weight. Some in the courtroom felt sympathy, others saw only manipulation. The sentence. The judge delivered the ruling with steady finality. Janice Howell was sentenced to 6 years in federal prison for bank fraud and embezzlement, along with an order to pay restitution. The figure $200,000 was largely symbolic. She would never be able to repay it in full. The judge's closing words cut to the heart of the matter. "You balanced books with lies, Mrs. Howell, and lies do not balance forever. A community bank is more than ledgers and deposits. It is trust, and you dismantled that trust piece by piece." Life in prison. Janice's adjustment to prison was stark. She had spent her adult life behind a desk, her days marked by routine and numbers. Now she lived in a regimented world of counts, searches, and loss of control. Other inmates called her the banker. Some mocked her for stealing pennies compared to real criminals. But Janice's crime was not about scale, it was about betrayal, and that burden weighed heavier than her sentence. She participated in financial responsibility programs, where instructors used her case as an example of how embezzlement grows from small acts into ruin. In group counseling, she often sat in silence, unable to explain why she crossed the line in the first place. The community rebuilds. Back in town, the bank worked hard to restore confidence. They installed stricter oversight measures, implemented dual verification for teller transactions, and increased audits. Customers were reassured that their funds were now safer than ever. But the scars lingered. Some longtime customers moved their money to larger regional banks, unwilling to trust the small branch again. Others stayed but carried a quiet wariness each time they handed over cash. Employees who had once admired Janice now spoke of her with mixed feelings. Some felt betrayed, others pitied her, and a few admitted they still couldn't reconcile the kind woman they knew with the fraudster she became. Reflection. Janice's story is not one of spectacular heists or dramatic getaways. It is the story of how ordinary crimes, small lies repeated over years, can hollow out a community. The thefts were quiet, almost invisible, but their weight accumulated until the collapse was inevitable. The tragedy lies not only in the money lost, but in the erosion of something harder to quantify: faith in institutions, trust in familiar faces, and the sense that the person across the counter is truly working in your interest. The lingering question. And yet, even after sentencing, one question remained unresolved. How much did Janice really steal? Auditors estimated $200,000, but embezzlement by lapping often leaves gaps that can never be fully traced. Some customers swore they lost more than the records reflected. Others believed their accounts had been manipulated years earlier, long before the investigation began. The exact figure may never be known. Perhaps that uncertainty is fitting. After all, Janice's crime was never just about numbers. It was about trust lost in increments impossible to measure, impossible to replace. Closing thought. When Janice left the bank in handcuffs, she wasn't just walking away from a career. She was walking away from decades of relationships, from a role that had once made her a pillar of stability. The teller who balanced books with lies ended up in a place where the only numbers that mattered were years behind bars. And the town, left behind, learned a hard truth. Sometimes the most dangerous thefts aren't the ones that take money from vaults, but the ones that quietly drain trust from the people who keep watch over them. Story 4. The Ghost of the Check-Kiting Farmer. On the surface, it looked like any other farm in the Midwest. Wide fields of soybeans, a weathered barn with faded red paint, and a white farmhouse with a porch that creaked in the wind. To neighbors, the man who lived there, Earl Whitman, was just another farmer trying to make ends meet in a world that had grown harsher for small agriculture. But beneath that image of simple country life, Earl had built something else. Not a farm of thriving crops, but a paper empire of bouncing checks that fooled banks, businesses, and neighbors alike. For years, his scheme allowed him to appear successful while debt mounted like storm clouds on the horizon. And when it finally collapsed, the fallout would earn him the haunting title of the ghost farmer. Farming in decline. The late 1980s and early 1990s were difficult years for farmers in the Midwest. Commodity prices fell, costs for equipment and fuel climbed, and small farms were increasingly squeezed by industrial agriculture. Earl was no exception. His land was fertile but modest, his equipment aging, and his debts mounting from years of poor harvests. Neighbors described him as proud, too proud perhaps. He hated asking for help. Instead, he carried himself with an air of confidence, assuring everyone that he had things under control. Few suspected how deeply he was struggling. The first check. Earl's scheme began with a single bounced check, more mistake than fraud. He had written a check to a feed supplier despite not having enough funds in his account. But by sheer timing, the deposit cleared because another check from a different account at a different bank arrived the same day. That overlap bought him time. And in that moment, Earl discovered the fragile loophole at the heart of check kiting. Banks often credited deposited checks before verifying the funds, creating a window in which money that didn't exist could appear real. To most people, an overdraft was a mistake. To Earl, it became a system. Building the kite. Over time, Earl opened more accounts, 3 at different banks, then 5. He wrote checks from one account to cover overdrafts in another, then used that credit to make purchases, pay debts, or withdraw cash. Each time, he counted on the delay between banks verifying funds. The scheme, known as check kiting, relied on constant motion. As long as Earl kept writing and depositing checks, the illusion held. Money seemed to exist, but only because it was always moving. Like a kite in the wind, the fraud required constant control, and once it dipped, the whole structure risked collapse. Earl grew skilled at timing. He knew the schedules of each bank, the days deposits cleared, the hours when tellers processed large batches. He drove from branch to branch in his dusty pickup truck, carrying stacks of checks in his worn leather ledger. To the banks, he looked like a hard-working farmer juggling finances. To his neighbors, he looked successful enough his farm equipment got updated, his bills appeared paid. In reality, he was building a castle of paper, one check at a time. Living the illusion. For nearly a decade, Earl lived in the shadow of his own fraud. His farm limped along, supported less by crops and more by circulating checks. He borrowed from neighbors, promising repayment that always seemed to come next month. He purchased new seed and fertilizer on credit, often using kited checks to cover the balances. Those who visited his farm described him as hospitable but oddly evasive. He spoke in vague terms about harvest yields and market prices, quick to change the subject. His wife, quiet and reserved, seemed to live in constant tension, as though afraid the truth might burst into the open at any moment. Despite the mounting debt, Earl carried himself with confidence. He believed he could manage it forever, that as long as he kept the kite in the air, no one would notice. The first suspicion. It was a young bank clerk who first noticed something strange. Working at a local branch, she saw Earl depositing large checks almost daily, often drawn from distant banks. The amounts were unusual for a farmer of his scale, and the timing was odd. Deposits always seemed to arrive just in time to cover overdrafts. She mentioned it to her manager, who shrugged it off at first. Farmers often had irregular cash flows, especially during planting and harvest seasons. But as weeks turned into months, the pattern grew harder to ignore. By then, Earl was juggling hundreds of thousands of dollars in floating checks. To him, it was survival. To the banks, it was theft waiting to be discovered. The collapse begins. The collapse began with a storm not of paper, but of weather. A poor harvest season left Earl unable to cover as many checks as usual. The timing slipped. One account failed to clear in time, creating a cascade of returned checks across his network of banks. Suddenly, the kite fell from the sky. Banks called each other, discovering the web of worthless paper Earl had woven. What had once seemed like liquidity was revealed as fraud. Neighbors were stunned. Suppliers realized they had been paid with rubber checks. The farm, which had looked modest but steady, was exposed as hollow. The ghost farmer. When investigators tried to confront Earl, he was gone. His pickup truck was found abandoned at the edge of his property. His farmhouse stood empty, his fields unplanted. Some neighbors swore they saw him hitching a ride west. Others believed he slipped away in the night, leaving everything behind. The authorities called it financial fraud, banks called it theft, but locals gave it another name: the ghost farmer. To this day, no one is certain how much money Earl siphoned through his scheme. Estimates range from a few $100,000 to over $1 million in floating checks. The farm was auctioned off, debts written into the ledgers of creditors who never fully recovered. But the man himself, he was never seen in town again. The unresolved question. When Earl Whitman's truck was found abandoned at the edge of his soybean field, the town was left with more questions than answers. The banks called it fraud, the sheriff called it unfinished business, and the neighbors whispered that the farmer had simply walked off into the night, leaving behind a hollow farm and hollow promises. But the story didn't end with Earl's disappearance. In many ways, that was where it truly began. The investigators step in. The FDIC and state banking regulators descended on the small town within weeks of Earl's vanishing. What had initially looked like a farmer's financial mismanagement was soon revealed as a deliberate web of fraud. Earl had been writing and depositing thousands of checks between 5 different banks, keeping them in constant circulation to cover non-existent balances. Investigators calculated that at the height of his scheme, he had nearly $1.2 million in checks, in flight, money that only existed in the clearing delay between institutions. When the scheme collapsed, the banks were left clawing back losses, trying to determine who owed what. For a small farming community, the numbers were staggering. Neighbors caught in the web. The human fallout was just as messy. Earl hadn't limited his kiting to banks. He had involved neighbors, feed suppliers, and even relatives, using personal checks to buy himself time. Some families discovered that loans they had extended to Earl were backed only by worthless paper. One neighbor, a cattle rancher, recalled selling Earl several head of livestock on what he thought was a valid check. By the time the bank called me, the money was gone, and so was Earl, he said bitterly. Others described how Earl would borrow cash in small amounts, $500 here, $1,000 there, promising repayment once the harvest came in. The harvest never came. For some, those loans represented years of savings. Earl hadn't just robbed banks, he had robbed the community's faith in him. The ghost stories begin. As weeks turned to months without Earl's return, rumors spread. Some claimed he had been spotted at a truck stop 2 towns over. Others swore he was working under a false name in Oklahoma. A few insisted he had fled to Canada. But then came darker whispers. Some neighbors believed Earl never left. They pointed to the abandoned truck, the uncollected personal items in his farmhouse, the absence of money trails after his disappearance. Men like Earl don't just vanish, one local said. Either someone helped him or the land swallowed him. Soon, the farm itself became a kind of ghost story. Children dared each other to walk past the abandoned barn at night. Farmers passing by after dusk claimed they saw lights flickering in the windows. though the electricity had been cut off for months. To the town, Earl wasn't just a man who had committed fraud, he was a specter haunting the edges of their fields. The mechanics of the fraud. Meanwhile, investigators pieced together the technical details of Earl's check kiting. They traced the timing of deposits and withdrawals, mapping out a system that had run like clockwork for nearly a decade. Account juggling. Earl maintained active checking accounts at 5 banks within a 50-mile radius, each with minimal balances. Daily deposits. He deposited checks from one bank into another every morning, creating the illusion of available funds. Float manipulation. He carefully tracked the clearing times: 2 days here, 3 days there, to maximize the window in which phantom money appeared real. Cash withdrawals. Using the float, he withdrew actual cash before the checks bounced, leaving banks chasing one another for restitution. It was a textbook kite, but what made it unusual was its longevity. Most schemes collapse within months. Earl had kept his afloat for nearly 10 years. The family silence. Reporters tried to reach Earl's family, but his wife and children refused to speak. They left town shortly after his disappearance, moving in with relatives out of state. Some believed they knew where Earl had gone but chose to protect him. Others suspected they had been just as blindsided as the neighbors. A single comment from a cousin offered a glimpse. Earl wasn't a bad man, but he was drowning. He thought he could outrun it. Maybe he thought he could outrun himself. The trial that never happened. Prosecutors prepared charges of bank fraud and wire fraud in absentia. Had Earl been caught, he would have faced up to 20 years in federal prison. But without a defendant, the case stalled. Warrants were issued, but years passed without a trace. Banks wrote off millions in losses, tightening their oversight procedures. Farmers who had once relied on Earl as a neighbor now spoke of him only in the past tense. The farm was auctioned off at a fraction of its worth, the barn left to decay. In the end, Earl became less a man than a cautionary tale. The unresolved question. What made the story haunting wasn't just the fraud, but the disappearance. Did Earl truly vanish into another life, perhaps working under an assumed name in another farming town? Or did he meet a darker fate, unable to face the collapse of his lies? Some say his body lies buried on the land he could no longer call his own. Others believe he's still out there, a ghost not of the land but of the banking system, one of many small-town fraudsters who slipped through the cracks. And so the unresolved question remains. Was Earl a fugitive who escaped, or a ghost who never left? Years after the collapse of Earl Whitman's check kiting scheme, the small Midwestern town still spoke his name in hushed tones. For some, he was a conman who tricked neighbors and banks alike. For others, he was a tragic figure, a farmer too proud to admit defeat, who built a financial house of cards until it all came crashing down. And for many, he was neither man nor myth, but a ghost, a presence that lingered long after his truck was found abandoned at the edge of his fields. The aftermath for the banks. The financial fallout was immediate. 5 regional banks had been caught in Earl's web, each left with stacks of worthless paper. Together, they absorbed losses estimated at $1.2 million, though the true figure was never fully calculated. Executives scrambled to explain how one farmer had manipulated them for nearly a decade. The answer lay in the gaps between oversight. In the 1980s and early 1990s, banking systems were less integrated than they are today. Clearing delays, lack of real-time monitoring, and reliance on personal relationships left institutions vulnerable. Earl had exploited those blind spots with precision. In the aftermath, banks across the state tightened procedures. They shortened float times, introduced electronic verification, and trained tellers to recognize suspicious patterns. In a way, Earl's fraud accelerated reforms that made banking safer for everyone, though his community paid the price for those lessons. The community's wounds. For neighbors, the losses were more personal. Families who had loaned Earl money never saw repayment. A cattle rancher lost nearly $20,000 in livestock sales. Local feed suppliers wrote off unpaid bills that forced some into bankruptcy. Even those who hadn't lost money felt betrayed. Earl had been part of the community, a man who attended church on Sundays, who waved at neighbors from his truck, who spoke warmly about future harvests. To discover that his confidence was built on lies left many questioning their own judgment. One elderly neighbor summed it up. It wasn't the money. It was knowing he looked us in the eye while handing us bad checks. The search that faded. Authorities pursued Earl for years. Warrants were issued, tips followed. Reports surfaced of sightings in truck stops, small towns, even across the Canadian border. Each lead fizzled. By the early 2000s, the search had slowed. The FBI still listed him as a fugitive, but resources shifted elsewhere. For all practical purposes, Earl had disappeared into the fog of unfinished cases. Some locals believed he had died quietly, perhaps by his own hand. Others insisted he was still alive, working under a false name, blending into another farming community where no one knew his past. The truth remained out of reach, feeding the legend of the ghost farmer. The farm itself. The Whitman farm was auctioned at pennies on the dollar. Equipment was sold off, livestock scattered. The farmhouse stood vacant for years, its paint peeling, windows broken by weather and vandals. Teenagers dared one another to sneak inside, claiming they heard footsteps or saw flickering lights. By the late 2000s, the property was bulldozed and replanted with soybeans under new ownership. But even then, locals referred to it not by its legal parcel number, but as Earl's Place. The land carried the weight of his story, as though the soil itself remembered. Lessons for the future. Earl's scheme became a case study for banks and regulators. Training seminars used his story to illustrate how long-term kiting could thrive if left unchecked. His fraud was small compared to corporate scandals, but it was a perfect example of how desperation and opportunity combined to create crime. For farmers, too, the lesson cut deep. Pride, debt, and silence had driven Earl further into dishonesty. Neighbors spoke of the importance of asking for help before desperation turned into fraud. The story became a cautionary tale, not just about money, but about the dangers of trying to maintain appearances at all costs. The lingering mystery. Even now, the mystery remains unresolved. Did Earl vanish to start a new life, his skills in timing and deception repurposed elsewhere? Did he die in obscurity, a nameless figure buried far from the land he once called home? Or did he, as some believe, never leave at all, his bones hidden beneath the soil of the farm that betrayed him? The truth may never be known. In that uncertainty lies the power of the story. Earl became less a man than a symbol of the fragility of trust, the dangers of unchecked pride, and the thin line between survival and crime. Final reflection. Check kiting is often dismissed as a paper crime, victimless in the eyes of those who don't understand its reach. But Earl's story shows otherwise. Every bounced check left ripples. Businesses shuttered, families strained, neighbors wary. What began as a survival tactic became a decade-long deception that hollowed out an entire community's trust. And when it ended, Earl was gone, leaving behind nothing but debts, rumors, and a name that still drifts through the fields like a shadow. The ghost farmer was never caught, never tried, never sentenced. His punishment was different, to be remembered not as a man who grew crops from the soil, but as one who harvested lies from paper. Story 5. The Forgotten Jewel Heist of a Retirement Home. Retirement homes are places where life slows down. Residents gather for card games, routine meals, and the occasional community outing. The halls echo with quiet conversations and the clatter of walkers, not the drama of crime. That's what makes this story so unsettling. In a setting meant for peace and care, someone orchestrated a theft that left the elderly victims not just poorer, but shaken in ways they couldn't quite put into words. This was not the kind of heist that involved vaults, alarms, or armed intruders. It was quieter, subtler, and for years almost forgotten. The setting, the Maplewood retirement residence, located in upstate New York, wasn't luxurious, but it was well kept. The brick building stood on the edge of town, with flower beds lining the entrance and rocking chairs scattered along the porch. Inside, residents kept modest rooms, often decorated with family photos, small heirlooms, and mementos of lives already largely lived. Among those mementos, however, were items far more valuable than the staff realized. Wedding rings passed down through generations, watches that had survived wars, brooches tucked away in drawers, and necklaces given as final gifts from long-departed spouses. These weren't simply trinkets, they were legacies. And they began to disappear. The first losses. At first, no one was sure anything had happened at all. An elderly woman named Margaret believed she had misplaced her pearl necklace. Another resident, Mr. Harlan, thought he had accidentally left his father's pocket watch in the laundry. A third, Mrs. Keating, couldn't find her wedding band, but her memory had been faltering, and staff assumed it was simply gone. For months, the missing items were explained away as the forgetfulness of age. Families assumed their loved ones had misplaced things. Staff quietly sighed with relief. After all, what could be more awkward than accusing someone of theft in a retirement home? But as the list grew, denial became harder to maintain. Patterns emerged. By the end of the year, nearly a dozen residents had reported lost items. Jewelry was the most common, but small cash stashes vanished too. Envelopes tucked in dresser drawers, dollar bills hidden in old books, coins from collections. The pattern was too consistent to ignore. These weren't random losses. Someone was stealing. Families grew angry. Some accused the staff of negligence. Others suggested fellow residents might be responsible. Management, under pressure, called in local police. The investigators. The police faced a delicate challenge. A retirement home was not a typical crime scene. Investigators had to balance suspicion with compassion, knowing the victims were elderly and sometimes struggling with memory issues. But even with those hurdles, the evidence pointed toward theft. The question was who? The suspects were limited. Maplewood had a relatively small staff: nurses, aides, cleaning crews, kitchen workers, along with occasional outside contractors. Residents themselves were unlikely culprits, given their mobility limitations, though police didn't rule it out entirely. Surveillance cameras were installed in hallways and common areas. Police began interviewing staff and residents, searching for inconsistencies. For weeks, nothing turned up. Then came the break. A suspicious employee. One aide, Daniel Morris, began drawing quiet attention. Residents often mentioned that he was unusually interested in their personal items, asking about jewelry or commenting on trinkets in their rooms. He was friendly, almost overly so, and had a reputation for being helpful to a fault. But what tipped suspicion was his schedule. Nearly every theft corresponded with nights when Daniel had been on shift. Police dug into his background. What they found painted a troubling picture: financial struggles, mounting debts, and a prior job at another care facility that ended abruptly under vague circumstances. The more they looked, the clearer the pattern became. The method. Investigators believe Daniel exploited the vulnerability of his workplace. Residents trusted him. He was the young man who fetched them water, adjusted their pillows, and listened to their stories. He had easy access to their rooms under the pretense of care. When residents slept or were distracted, Daniel quietly rifled through drawers and jewelry boxes, taking items small enough to pocket. Because many residents had memory lapses, he relied on confusion to cover his tracks. If questioned, he could always feign ignorance or suggest the items were misplaced. It was a cruel exploitation of trust. The breakthrough. The breakthrough came when a local pawnshop reported a series of jewelry sales matching descriptions from Maplewood. The seller had used his real ID, Daniel Morris. With this evidence, police moved quickly. They arrested Daniel during a night shift, pulling him aside as residents slept down the hall. In his locker, they found several rings, a gold watch, and a silver locket, all reported missing. The quiet halls of Maplewood were suddenly a crime scene. The unresolved question. As Daniel was taken away, the community felt both relief and unease. Relief that the thefts were solved, unease that it had happened at all. How long had he been stealing? How many items had already been sold or lost forever? Families demanded answers, but many pieces were never recovered. For residents, the theft wasn't just about jewelry or cash. It was about dignity, the violation of their last safe space. And so the question lingers. Had Daniel stolen only what police found, or had Maplewood lost treasures that would never surface again? When Daniel Morris was arrested, the shockwaves at Maplewood retirement residence were immediate. Residents awoke to whispers in the hallways, staff avoided eye contact, and family members crowded the lobby demanding explanations. For a community that prided itself on safety and calm, the idea that someone trusted with care had been stealing from the very people he was hired to protect was devastating. But the arrest was only the beginning. What followed was a trial that revealed unsettling truths about the vulnerabilities of elder care and raised questions about how many other facilities across the country might harbor their own hidden thieves. The recovery effort. Police began cataloging the evidence seized from Daniel's locker, home, and pawn shop records. The haul included nearly 50 items: rings, watches, bracelets, and even a few envelopes of cash. Families came forward to identify pieces, their relief tempered by sadness. One daughter cried as she clasped her mother's wedding ring, recovered from a pawn shop. Another resident, Mr. Harlan, never saw his father's pocket watch again. It had already been melted down for scrap. For many, the losses were permanent, their heirlooms scattered beyond recovery. The recovery effort also revealed the scale of the crime. Police estimated Daniel had stolen over $120,000 worth of items in just 2 years. Yet because many of the residents' valuables were never officially appraised or insured, the true figure was likely much higher. The charges. Daniel faced a long list of charges: larceny, exploitation of vulnerable adults, possession of stolen property, and fraud. Prosecutors emphasized the betrayal of trust, arguing that his crimes went beyond theft. They represented a deliberate preying upon society's most defenseless members. The defense, however, tried to soften the narrative. His lawyer argued that Daniel had been under extreme financial stress, supporting 2 children while drowning in medical debt. He painted a picture of a desperate man, not a malicious predator. But the community wasn't convinced. In their eyes, Daniel had crossed a line that could never be excused. Voices from the victims. At pre-trial hearings, families and residents gave statements. Their words carried more weight than the dollar amounts listed in court documents. He didn't just steal jewelry. He stole the last gift my husband ever gave me. We trusted him. He was supposed to take care of my mother. Instead, he took from her. When you're old, you already lose so much: your health, your independence. To lose your dignity, too, is unbearable. These testimonies painted Daniel not as a man in debt, but as a predator who chose the easiest targets, those who could not fight back. The trial. The trial took place over 3 weeks in county court. Reporters filled the back rows, intrigued by the unusual nature of the crime. Crimes against the elderly were often underreported, and the Maplewood case provided a rare, public glimpse into how such exploitation unfolded. Prosecutors laid out a methodical case: Daniel's access to rooms, the timing of thefts, the pawn shop records, and the recovered items. They showed jurors the surveillance footage not of Daniel stealing directly, but of him entering rooms without documented reasons, lingering longer than necessary. The defense leaned heavily on his financial desperation, claiming Daniel was a man cornered by circumstance. They even suggested that some residents had donated items to him willingly, though this claim quickly unraveled under questioning. The verdict. The jury deliberated less than a day. Daniel Morris was found guilty on all major charges. He was sentenced to 12 years in state prison with eligibility for parole after 8. For some, the sentence felt fair. For others, especially families who never recovered their heirlooms, it felt hollow. As one resident put it, "He'll get out one day, but we'll never get back what we lost." Ripple effects on elder care. The Maplewood case did more than put Daniel behind bars. It sparked wider discussions about elder care security. State regulators introduced new requirements for retirement homes, including stricter background checks for employees, mandatory reporting of thefts, and regular audits of resident complaints. Other facilities across the state installed more surveillance cameras and tightened visitor logs. Advocacy groups seized the moment to highlight the broader issue of elder abuse, arguing that financial exploitation was one of the most common and least prosecuted crimes against seniors. The community's healing. For Maplewood, healing took time. Some residents admitted they no longer trusted staff in the same way. Families hesitated before leaving valuables with loved ones, often removing jewelry and heirlooms entirely. The staff, too, felt the sting of suspicion. Most had worked tirelessly and honestly, but Daniel's actions cast a shadow over them all. Some left their jobs, unwilling to face the constant questioning of families who once greeted them warmly. The lingering doubts. Even after the conviction, doubts lingered. Some residents swore more items had vanished than police acknowledged. Others claimed Daniel couldn't have acted alone, that perhaps another staff member, or even an outside contractor, had quietly joined in. Investigators never proved such theories. Officially, Daniel was the sole perpetrator, but in Maplewood's hallways, whispers continued. Was he the only one, or just the only one who got caught? The unresolved question. The Maplewood case ended in a conviction, but it left behind an unsettling truth. Thefts from the elderly often go unnoticed, dismissed as memory lapses or simple misplacement. If Daniel had not been caught, how many more families would have lost their treasures? How many similar crimes remain hidden in other retirement homes, cloaked in the fog of old age? The question lingers. Is Maplewood an isolated tragedy or just one visible piece of a much larger, quieter crime wave against the elderly? By the time the trial ended and Daniel Morris began serving his sentence, Maplewood retirement residents had already changed. The home that once prided itself on being a place of peace now carried a permanent scar. The residents' daily lives resumed bingo nights, quiet dinners, morning walks in the courtyard, but beneath the routines lay an unease that never fully went away. The story of the forgotten jewel heist might have ended with a guilty verdict, but the long-term consequences stretched far beyond the walls of one retirement facility. Daniel behind bars. Prison records show Daniel struggled in his early years of incarceration. Unlike in Maplewood, he no longer carried authority or trust. Inmates, often keen to exploit weakness, mocked him for his crime. Stealing from the elderly was considered among the lowest of offenses. In letters later obtained by reporters, Daniel expressed regret, but his words rang hollow. He admitted to pawning dozens of items but insisted he never meant to hurt anyone. To the families of Maplewood, the statement felt like another betrayal. His crime hadn't been an accident. It had been a pattern carried out over years. The forgotten victims. For the residents, the wounds lingered long after the trial. A woman named Margaret never forgave herself for believing she had simply misplaced her necklace. She told her daughter, "If I'd spoken up sooner, maybe he wouldn't have stolen from the others. Mr. Harlan grew quiet after losing his father's pocket watch. Staff noticed he rarely spoke about his family anymore. Small losses, objects no bigger than a palm, carried outsized weight because they represented memory, history, and connection. Some residents began hiding what little they had left. Lockboxes appeared under beds, taped drawers, even notes reminding themselves where valuables were stored. Trust, once so freely given, had been replaced with suspicion. Families and fallout. Families also bore the burden. For some, the loss was financial, but for most, it was emotional. The jewelry and keepsakes taken were not replaceable. They were the last tangible links to parents, spouses, or siblings long gone. One daughter, interviewed years later, put it simply, "You can't replace your mother's ring. It doesn't matter what it's worth in dollars. It's worth her life, her story, and that's what he stole." Maplewood's response. Management at Maplewood faced lawsuits from several families, claiming negligence in preventing the thefts. Though the facility settled most cases quietly, the financial hit was significant, but the greater damage was to its reputation. New policies were rolled out. Locking storage provided in each room. Mandatory staff monitoring of personal access to residents' rooms. Regular audits of complaints, ensuring no report of theft could be dismissed as forgetfulness without investigation. Surveillance expansion to cover more than hallways. Now cameras oversaw entrances, exits, and common room activities. These measures helped restore a measure of security, but the community never quite returned to its earlier comfort. A broader legal shift. Beyond Maplewood, the case became a reference point for policymakers. Elder advocacy groups cited it in campaigns for tougher laws against financial exploitation. Within a few years, New York State passed amendments strengthening penalties for crimes targeting vulnerable adults. Prosecutors gained clearer authority to pursue theft in elder care settings as aggravated offenses. Other states followed suit, and training programs for care workers began, including modules on ethical responsibility and fraud prevention. The silence that enables crime. The Maplewood case also forced a painful reckoning. For years, the thefts went unnoticed because of a simple assumption that elderly residents misplaced things. Memory lapses, dementia, and confusion created the perfect cover for theft. Experts began warning that such assumptions allowed abuse to thrive. In reality, elder financial exploitation was one of the fastest-growing categories of crime in America, often carried out by caregivers, relatives, or trusted community members. Yet most cases went unreported. The lesson was clear: silence is fertile ground for exploitation. Daniel's legacy. When Daniel eventually became eligible for parole, debate resurfaced. Some argued he had served his time, that his debts were paid. Others insisted crimes like his left permanent damage that no sentence could erase. Parole boards weigh remorse, rehabilitation, and public safety. But in Maplewood's case, residents and families submitted statements urging against release. For them, Daniel was not just a man who stole jewelry, he was a symbol of betrayal, a reminder of how vulnerable the elderly could be. A changed community. Years after the thefts, Maplewood continued to operate, but its culture had shifted. Residents remained cautious, families remained vigilant, and staff, though many were dedicated and compassionate, worked under a cloud of suspicion that had never existed before. In a sense, the crime had stolen more than valuables. It had stolen peace of mind. Reflection. The forgotten jewel heist of Maplewood retirement residence serves as a quiet but powerful reminder. Crime does not always look like a bank robbery or a dramatic police chase. Sometimes it looks like a kind smile, a helpful aid, and a hand reaching into a drawer while no one is watching. It is a story about more than theft. It is about the fragility of trust, the weight of memory, and the responsibility society carries toward those who cannot defend themselves. And it leaves us with an unsettling thought. If these crimes could go unnoticed for years in Maplewood, how many other retirement homes hold secrets just as troubling, still buried in silence? Story 6. The Counterfeit Book Collector. In the dim light of an antiquarian book fair, collectors huddled over velvet-draped tables, whispering about first editions, rare bindings, and the thrill of discovery. The air smelled faintly of dust and leather. Among the enthusiasts was a man who seemed as unremarkable as any other attendee. Simon Fletcher, a middle-aged bibliophile with thinning hair, round glasses, and an enthusiasm for 19th-century literature. But beneath his soft-spoken demeanor, Simon carried a secret that would unravel one of the strangest fraud cases in the world of books. Over the course of several years, he built a collection worth hundreds of thousands of dollars not by acquiring genuine rarities, but by meticulously counterfeiting them. His crime wasn't violent, nor was it flashy. Yet in the insular world of collectors, it was devastating. The rise of a collector. Simon's fascination with books began as a child. He grew up in a modest London suburb, where his father worked as a postman and his mother as a schoolteacher. The family couldn't afford luxuries, but Simon discovered treasures in the local library, novels, biographies, and histories that opened worlds beyond his quiet neighborhood. As an adult, he worked as a clerk, never earning much, but his evenings were consumed by literature. He spent weekends trawling flea markets and second-hand shops. Slowly, he began amassing a small but cherished collection of first editions Dickens, Austen, and obscure poets long out of print. By his 40s, Simon was a familiar face at book fairs, known for his encyclopedic memory of publishing histories and edition quirks. What few knew was that his passion had curdled into something darker: envy. He couldn't afford the rarities he coveted, and each time he saw wealthier collectors make purchases, bitterness took root. The first forgeries. The shift from collector to counterfeiter began innocuously. Simon bought a worn edition of Great Expectations at a market for less than £10. Though it wasn't valuable, he wondered what it might look like if it were a first edition. In his flat, he began experimenting. He aged paper with tea, mimicked Victorian ink using crushed berries and iron filings, and studied online guides to identifying first editions. He even learned old bookbinding techniques from YouTube tutorials and library archives. At first, it was a hobby challenge to see if he could make something look authentic, but when he showed a replica to another collector, they praised its appearance without realizing it was fake. Simon felt a thrill. If his peers couldn't tell the difference, perhaps no one could. Scaling the scheme. Over time, Simon grew bolder. He purchased cheap, later printing editions of classic novels and altered them, replacing title pages, forging publisher marks, distressing bindings. He targeted works that were rare enough to be valuable but common enough that experts might not examine them too closely. Then came his first sale. At a regional fair, he offered what appeared to be a first edition of Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights. He'd bought the base copy for £40. He sold the forgery for nearly £3,000. The buyer never returned. The deal emboldened him. Soon, Simon was producing and selling forged first editions of Dickens, Shelley, Byron, and more. The community of collectors. Book collecting is a tight-knit world where reputations carry weight. Simon's growing presence and his uncanny ability to discover rare volumes raised eyebrows. Some collectors admired his luck, others grew suspicious. But suspicion wasn't proof. Many of his customers were hobbyists themselves, eager to believe they'd stumbled upon treasures. To question their purchases was to question their judgment, something few were willing to do publicly. Simon exploited this pride. He cultivated an image of humility, never bragging, always presenting himself as a man simply passionate about literature. When he sold, he underpriced his wares slightly, ensuring quick transactions. The break in the illusion. The scheme might have continued indefinitely if not for a single mistake. In 2012, Simon sold a supposed first edition of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein to a wealthy collector named Richard Hall. Hall, unlike most buyers, was meticulous. He consulted a specialist who immediately spotted inconsistencies. The paper stock was wrong, the binding too modern, and the publisher's mark slightly off-center. Hall confronted Simon, who denied wrongdoing, insisting he had acquired the book innocently. But Hall wasn't convinced. He reported the matter to authorities and, more importantly, began warning others in the collecting community. Investigation begins. Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit, typically more accustomed to paintings and sculptures, now found itself drawn into the world of books. Detectives began tracing Simon's sales through auction records, dealer accounts, and private testimonies. The deeper they looked, the stranger the case appeared. Simon wasn't just altering books, he was creating convincing histories for them, inventing provenance through forged letters and fabricated sales receipts. In one case, he had written a fake note from a supposed Victorian owner, tucked inside the book as evidence of its authenticity. What investigators uncovered was not a man selling occasional fakes, but someone running a long-term operation that duped dozens of buyers and dealers. The fragility of trust. The scandal sent shockwaves through the antiquarian world. Collectors who had purchased books from Simon began privately checking their shelves. Auction houses faced embarrassment as some realized they had unknowingly sold fakes. The affair exposed how much the rare book market relied on trust and reputation rather than rigorous verification. Experts admitted that even seasoned dealers could be fooled, especially when the forgery was just convincing enough. Simon, in his quiet apartment surrounded by paper scraps and ink stains, had revealed the fragility of a community built on passion and prestige. The unresolved question. As police built their case, collectors whispered among themselves. How many of Simon's forgeries were still out there, sitting on shelves, treated as treasures? Some would never be discovered. Others might pass hands for years before scrutiny revealed the truth. And the larger question loomed. In a world where value is tied not just to words, but to the material form of a book, how easy is it for desire to blind us to authenticity? When Scotland Yard's Art and Antiques Unit began investigating Simon Fletcher, they quickly realized this was no ordinary fraud. Unlike art forgers, who sometimes gain notoriety through flamboyance, Simon had built his scheme in shadows, threading himself into a community where trust often meant more than paperwork. Detectives combed through auction records, private dealer logs, and Simon's own bank statements. Each sale a Dickens here, a Shelley there added up. Slowly, a pattern emerged. Simon consistently had access to rare editions that would be improbable for someone of his modest means. To strengthen their case, investigators reached out to buyers. Many were reluctant to admit they had been duped. For wealthy collectors, acknowledging fraud was embarrassing. It meant they had been fooled despite their expertise. For smaller buyers, there was denial. They didn't want to believe their prized possessions were fakes. But as suspicions coalesced, more victims came forward. Each forged book was another brick in the wall of evidence. Inside Simon's workshop, the eventual search of Simon's flat stunned investigators. His modest one-bedroom unit was less a home than a workshop. Piles of old books lined the walls, their spines stripped, pages torn, covers removed. On his desk sat inks in amber bottles, parchment soaked in tea, and a small press for rebinding. Stacks of forged title pages, meticulously crafted, were discovered in folders. Each bore minute adjustments, the faint discoloration of ink, the uneven alignment of type designed to mimic printing inconsistencies of earlier centuries. There were also notebooks filled with Simon's research. He had copied publishers' records by hand, studied the tiniest details of bindings, and even charted aging techniques. In one margin, an investigator found a chilling note. Perfection is not the goal, believability is. It revealed Simon's philosophy. He wasn't trying to create flawless counterfeits, he was creating convincing stories. The scope widens. What stunned detectives most wasn't just the forgeries, but the scale of Simon's deception. He had been operating for nearly a decade, moving books through fairs, auctions, and private sales. At least 80 volumes were confirmed as fakes. Experts speculated the real number could be double. The total fraud was valued at over £500,000, though much of that figure was imprecise after all. The true worth of rare books fluctuates with markets and reputations. The impact spread far beyond monetary loss. Several auction houses were forced to issue refunds, tarnishing their credibility. Private collectors quietly withdrew from the community, fearful of buying more forgeries. Some even abandoned the hobby entirely. Simon had not just stolen money, he had destabilized the fragile ecosystem of trust that bound collectors together. Simon's defense. When finally confronted, Simon did not behave like the calculating criminal investigators expected. He did not deny the accusations, but neither did he admit guilt outright. Instead, he framed himself as an outsider misunderstood by a wealthy, elitist community. "They think they own literature," he told one detective. "But words don't belong to them. I gave them what they wanted, an illusion they could hold in their hands. Isn't all collecting just illusion?" It was a strange argument, blurring philosophy and rationalization. But it revealed his mindset. Simon did not see himself as a thief. He saw himself as an equalizer, exposing the vanity of a system where paper and ink carried value only because people believed it did. The trial. In 2014, Simon was brought to trial in London. The courtroom was packed with reporters, collectors, and curious onlookers. For many, it was less about one man's guilt than about the integrity of the rare book trade itself. The prosecution presented a meticulous case. They displayed forged volumes side by side with genuine editions, highlighting mismatched paper fibers, incorrect printing techniques, and suspicious provenance. Expert witnesses testified about the laborious process of authentication and how Simon had exploited gaps in those systems. Simon's defense leaned heavily on intent. His barrister argued that Simon had not intended to defraud, but had created replicas that buyers assumed were genuine. They claimed he was merely indulging in a craft antiquarian bookbinding taken to its extreme. But the sheer number of falsified documents, receipts, and forged letters undercut that argument. These weren't casual replicas. They were designed to deceive. The community watches. Outside the courtroom, the scandal deepened divisions. Some collectors expressed grudging admiration for Simon's skill. Others saw him as a parasite who had poisoned their passion. The trial became a mirror, forcing the community to confront uncomfortable truths. How much of collecting was driven by ego, by the need to possess, to outdo rivals? Simon's scheme had only worked because buyers wanted to believe in his discoveries. They wanted the story of stumbling upon a hidden gem. One bookseller summed it up: "He preyed on our hope, and in this business hope is worth more than money." The verdict. After weeks of testimony, the jury delivered its decision. Simon was guilty of multiple counts of fraud. He was sentenced to 6 years in prison. For some, the punishment felt inadequate, considering the scale of his deception. For others, it was fitting. The quiet forger who had lived in obscurity for so long would spend years in the anonymity of a cell. The real punishment, however, was reputational. His name became synonymous with counterfeit books. Dealers whispered it as a warning. Auction houses used it as a case study. Simon Fletcher had achieved a kind of immortality, but not the one he had dreamed of. The aftershocks. Even after Simon's conviction, the damage lingered. Many of his forgeries were never recovered. They remained scattered across shelves, still passed down as heirlooms, still occasionally surfacing in auctions before being flagged. The market became more cautious. Authentication grew stricter, provenance more scrutinized. In a strange way, Simon's crime professionalized the trade, pushing it toward modern standards. But it also left a scar. Collectors no longer trusted one another as they once had. The warmth of book fairs cooled. Transactions felt heavier, less joyful, shadowed by the question, what if this is a fake? The cliffhanger. Years after his conviction, whispers emerged. Simon, even in prison, was writing a memoir. Rumors suggested he was chronicling not only his life, but also revealing how many more forgeries he had placed into circulation and where some of them might be. If true, such a book could upend the market all over again. Collectors debated whether they feared its publication or secretly longed for it. For Simon, locked away but still obsessed with books, perhaps this was his final act of authorship. A story only he could tell, one that blurred the line between crime and literature. Simon Fletcher entered prison at 43, a man whose hands had been more accustomed to the quiet work of ink and paper than steel bars and concrete floors. Fellow inmates initially mocked his book crimes. They expected a man who had conned banks, trafficked drugs, or led gangs, not someone who had sold counterfeit copies of Oliver Twist. But Simon adapted. He requested library duty, where he once again found himself surrounded by books, albeit tattered paperbacks, rather than priceless first editions. Prison librarians later recalled how he repaired volumes for other inmates, binding them with a care that belied their cheapness. In interviews years later, Simon admitted that prison gave him perspective. He saw himself less as a misunderstood craftsman and more as someone who had dismantled trust for his own advantage. Yet, he never fully conceded wrongdoing. He clung to the notion that his fakes were works of art in their own right. The memoir. 2 years into his sentence, word leaked that Simon was writing. Prison staff noted his constant scribbling, his requests for more paper. Visitors hinted that he was compiling a manuscript, part confession, part treatise on collecting. Rumors swirled. Some claimed the memoir contained a catalog of still undiscovered forgeries, hidden in collections across Europe. Others suggested it was less factual and more philosophical, Simon's manifesto on why literature should not be chained to commerce. Publishers, sensing a scandalous bestseller, expressed interest, but legal barriers complicated matters. Could a convicted fraudster profit from his crimes through a book deal? Laws varied, and in the UK, Son of Sam, statutes were not as sweeping as in the United States. The possibility of the memoir unsettled collectors. Every new rumor made them re-examine their shelves. If Simon named specific volumes, values could plummet overnight. The very act of speculation created waves of uncertainty in the rare book world. A changed marketplace. By the time Simon was released in 2019, the rare book trade had transformed. Auction houses had implemented stricter vetting procedures. Provenance, the chain of custody proving a book's authenticity, became nearly as important as the physical volume itself. Technology also stepped in. Fiber analysis, ink dating, and digital imaging were more widely used to detect inconsistencies invisible to the naked eye. Collectors who once relied solely on trust or intuition now demanded forensic evidence. Simon's crimes had pushed the trade into the modern era, but at a cost. The joy of stumbling upon a dusty bargain at a market stall was largely gone. Each transaction carried the weight of suspicion. One dealer described it best. Before Simon, we believed in stories. After Simon, we only believe in science. Simon's reemergence. Upon release, Simon returned to obscurity. He lived in a small rented flat, working sporadically as a book restorer. The community, however, never forgot him. Some collectors refused to be in the same room. Others sought him out, curious to hear his perspective. He never confirmed the memoir rumors, though whispers persisted. One journalist who interviewed him said Simon smiled slyly when asked about it, replying only, "Some books aren't meant to be published." The ambiguity only fueled speculation. Was there a manuscript hidden somewhere? Did it contain confessions or merely musings? The absence of clarity ensured Simon's name remained relevant long after his active forgery had ended. The victim's perspective. For collectors left with worthless forgeries, the wounds lingered. Some admitted they could not bring themselves to sell or destroy the books. Instead, they kept them as grim reminders of misplaced trust. A retired solicitor who had purchased a fake Dickens described it poignantly. "I still display it on my shelf, not as literature but as a lesson. Every time I see it, I remember how easily desire can cloud judgment." Ironically, Simon's fakes began acquiring a peculiar secondary value. Though legally worthless, some collectors traded them as curiosities, the works of a notorious forger, now themselves artifacts of crime history. Reflection on human behavior. Simon Fletcher's story is not just about counterfeit books. It is about the human hunger for authenticity, for stories we can touch. Collectors believed in Simon's forgeries because they wanted to believe. They wanted the romance of finding a treasure, of owning something no one else had. Simon understood this weakness and exploited it. His genius lay not in ink or paper, but in psychology. He sold illusions tailored to desire. And perhaps that is why his crimes linger in memory, because they expose not just the fragility of markets, but the fragility of belief itself. The lasting consequences. Today, whenever a suspicious volume surfaces, Simon's name is invoked. His case is studied in art crime seminars. Auction houses still use his forgeries as training examples. For the world of rare books, Simon's story became a parable. It warned against overconfidence, against the seduction of bargains too good to be true. It also showed how one man's quiet manipulations could ripple across an entire industry. For Simon himself, the legacy is more ambiguous. He left prison not infamous enough to be a household name, but never anonymous enough to vanish. His shadow lingers in the trade he once deceived, in every cautious handshake and forensic test. Closing reflection. When you think of crime, you may picture violence, theft, or grand scandals splashed across front pages. But Simon Fletcher reminds us that crime can be as quiet as turning a page. His fraud was not built on force, but on persuasion, on the delicate trust between seller and buyer. And perhaps the most unsettling thought is this: if Simon had never been caught, many of his forgeries might still be considered treasures today, sitting proudly on shelves, their deception undetected. Which raises a haunting question: how many counterfeit stories still lie hidden among the genuine, waiting to be discovered? Story 7. The Silent Poisoner of the Boarding House. In the early 1930s, in the heart of London's East End, life unfolded at a slower rhythm. The Great Depression had cast long shadows over the city, but in small pockets, people carried on with their routines, eking out a modest living while holding tight to their fragile stability. On one such quiet street stood the Welbeck Boarding House, a narrow brick building with peeling paint and a faint smell of boiled cabbage that clung to the curtains. It catered to working-class tenants, single men employed at nearby factories, widows renting rooms for a few shillings a week, and young clerks who found it cheaper than private lodging. Boarding houses were intimate, peculiar communities. Everyone knew everyone's habits: who came home late, who drank too much, who had visitors. Privacy was scarce, gossip plentiful. Yet, for all its closeness, the Welbeck boarding house harbored a secret far darker than anyone could have imagined. The landlady. At the center of it all was Mrs. Edith Kerrigan, a widow in her late 40s. Neat, proper, and endlessly attentive, She was regarded as the kind of landlady every tenant wanted. She provided hearty breakfasts, kept the hallways spotless, and remembered her tenants' birthdays. To the outside world, Edith was a figure of kindness. Tenants described her as having a motherly touch and a knack for making one feel at home. She attended church regularly and donated small sums to parish causes. But beneath her gentle exterior, Edith harbored frustrations. Widowhood had left her financially strained. The boarding house kept her afloat, but just barely. Many tenants fell behind on rent, and Edith often fretted about bills piling up. In her private diary later discovered during investigation, she confessed feelings of resentment. "They eat at my table, but they rob me blind. They owe me, yet smile as if the world owes them." The first death. It was in late spring of 1932 when the first tragedy struck. Mr. Arthur Milligan, a quiet man in his 60s, suddenly fell ill. Neighbors described him as pale and sweating, his stomach clenched in pain. Within days, he was dead. Doctors at the time attributed his passing to natural causes, gastritis, or perhaps food poisoning. Arthur had been in poor health, after all. Death was no stranger to boarding houses, where the elderly and lonely often lived their final years. His funeral passed with little fanfare. Edith attended, placing flowers on his coffin. The incident stirred sympathy rather than suspicion. A pattern emerges. But weeks later, another tenant, Miss Clara Hammond, fell ill. Clara was younger, only 32, and in good health. Yet she experienced the same agonizing cramps, dizziness, and sudden decline Arthur had. She, too, died within days. This time, whispers spread through the house. Coincidence? Perhaps. But two deaths so close together troubled some residents. Edith reassured them, insisting Clara must have caught a summer fever. She even cooked extra meals to cheer the others, her hands shaking ever so slightly as she ladled soup into bowls. When a third tenant, George Preston, died only months later under similar circumstances, murmurs turned into unease. Something was wrong. Suspicion and silence. Yet no one dared confront Edith. Tenants depended on her, and fear of losing their lodgings outweighed suspicion. Besides, Edith was the one who nursed the sick, sitting by their bedsides with cold cloths and tea. To accuse her would seem absurd. She was the caregiver, the one offering comfort in their final hours. Still, some noted peculiar details. George Preston, before his death, had told a friend his meals tasted oddly bitter. Clara had confided to another resident that she felt dizzy after tea, but these comments were brushed aside. Who would imagine that food itself was the weapon? The poison. In hindsight, investigators would later discover that Edith used arsenic, a common poison in the early 20th century. Arsenic was easily obtainable in small quantities, sold in powders and tonics as rat poison or even for cosmetic use. Mixed in tea or stew, the poison worked gradually, mimicking symptoms of natural illnesses. In an era before advanced toxicology, arsenic was the perfect murder weapon, discreet, deadly, and almost invisible. For Edith, each spoonful meant relief from financial strain. Dead tenants no longer owed her rent. Sometimes, their meager possessions, a watch, a few shillings, a trunk of clothes, fell to her as unclaimed property. The fourth death. By autumn of 1933, 4 tenants had died under Edith's roof. Authorities began to take notice. The local coroner remarked on the unusual frequency of deaths in one residence. An anonymous letter, later traced to a frightened tenant, reached police, urging them to investigate. Something is wrong at Welbeck House. Too many have gone too soon. It was only then that detectives began piecing the puzzle together. Exhumations were ordered. Stomach contents were tested. Traces of arsenic appeared in nearly every case. The cheerful, motherly landlady was suddenly viewed in a new light. The arrest. In December 1933, Edith Kerrigan was arrested on suspicion of murder. The news shocked the community. Parish members refused to believe it. Neighbors protested that she had always been kind. But detectives had evidence. Arsenic powders found in her pantry, her diary entries hinting at resentment toward tenants, and the undeniable toxicology results. The Welbeck boarding house became infamous overnight, its curtains drawn as reporters crowded outside. Residents fled, unwilling to sleep another night under its roof. Following her arrest in December 1933, detectives began a methodical review of the deaths at Welbeck boarding house. What had at first looked like a string of unfortunate illnesses now appeared to be a deliberate pattern. Exhumations confirmed what authorities had begun to suspect. Arsenic was present in the remains of multiple tenants. The discovery was damning. At least 4 exhumed bodies showed unmistakable levels of poisoning, and investigators theorized that the real number could be far higher. Neighbors described Edith Kerrigan as a kindly figure, but detectives noted her peculiar habit of being the only one present at each tenant's decline. She cooked their meals, tended their sickbeds, and conveniently inherited or absorbed any unpaid rent or abandoned belongings. Forensic evidence was bolstered by testimony from surviving tenants. Several remembered bitter tastes in tea or stew. One tenant claimed Edith insisted on personally serving everyone's portion, refusing to let them fetch food themselves. Another recounted how Edith discouraged outside medical consultations, preferring to treat the sick in-house with her remedies. The deeper police dug, the more the motherly facade seemed like a mask concealing calculated malice. Edith's motives. Money was the most obvious motive. Investigators found that Edith was consistently behind on utility bills and mortgage payments. Though the boarding house provided income, it was unreliable. When tenants couldn't pay, she often covered costs herself. Killing them erased the debts and freed up rooms for new lodgers. But detectives suspected there was more. Her diary revealed bitterness, not just financial frustration. Ungrateful mouths. They eat, they complain, they leave their filth for me. Better they be gone than drain me further. Some criminologists later suggested Edith's motives were complex. While financial relief played a role, there appeared to be an element of control and even resentment. Poison allowed her to dictate life and death quietly, to punish those she felt slighted by, and to maintain power in a life otherwise dominated by financial struggle and loneliness. Public reaction. When the story broke in London newspapers, it caused a sensation. "The boarding house of death," read one headline. Others referred to her as the Angel of Welbeck Street, mocking the maternal persona that had concealed her crimes. For many Londoners, the story was particularly disturbing because it violated the trust of domestic spaces. A boarding house was supposed to be safe, a substitute family for those without one. Edith's crimes struck at the heart of that security, reminding the public that evil could lurk in the most ordinary settings. Neighbors were torn between disbelief and horror. Parishioners recalled her donations and attendance at Sunday services, insisting she could not have poisoned anyone. But as evidence mounted, sympathy faded, replaced by a cold recognition of betrayal. The trial begins. Edith Kerrigan's trial opened at the Old Bailey in early 1934. Courtrooms were packed with journalists, curious citizens, and family members of the victims. The prosecution built its case on 3 pillars: forensic evidence, witness testimony, and Edith's own writings. Experts explained how arsenic, found in her pantry, matched the substance discovered in victims' bodies. Surviving tenants testified about bitter-tasting food and Edith's insistence on controlling meals. Handwriting experts authenticated her diary entries, presenting them as a chilling window into her thoughts. The defense countered with arguments of circumstantial evidence. They suggested the arsenic found in her pantry was common rat poison, necessary for an old house. They questioned the accuracy of toxicology, noting that arsenic was present in many household products, and they portrayed Edith as a hardworking widow scapegoated for coincidences. But prosecutors had a trump card, a surviving tenant named Thomas Riley, who testified that he had once secretly refused a meal Edith prepared. He gave his portion to stray cats in the alley, both of which died the following morning. The courtroom gasped at the revelation. Edith on the stand. When Edith testified, she maintained composure. Dressed modestly, she spoke softly, insisting she cared for her tenants like family. She denied poisoning anyone, claiming her diary was a private venting of frustrations, not evidence of intent. Her demeanor unsettled some observers. Journalists described her as eerily calm, coldly detached, and maternal in tone but chilling in implication. It was as if she still played the role of landlady, reassuring everyone of her innocence while the facts told another story. The jury's dilemma. After weeks of testimony, the jury faced a difficult task. Edith was not a violent killer in the traditional sense. Her crimes lacked blood or spectacle. They were quiet, patient, and intimate. Some jurors reportedly struggled with the notion of a woman, especially a widow of humble means, committing calculated murder. Gender stereotypes of the era painted women as nurturers, not predators. Yet, the evidence was overwhelming. The verdict. In March 1934, Edith Kerrigan was found guilty of multiple counts of murder by arsenic poisoning. The judge described her as a predator of quiet cruelty, who turned her home into a place of death. She was sentenced to death by hanging, though her legal team immediately appealed. Public opinion was divided. Some demanded her execution, while others argued for leniency, citing her fragile health and difficult circumstances. After her conviction in 1934, Edith Kerrigan's legal team swiftly filed an appeal. They argued that the evidence against her was circumstantial, that arsenic was too common a substance to prove intent, and that her diary was taken out of context. But while the appeal made its way through the courts, investigators continued to sift through Edith's past. Their search led them to Holloway House, a smaller lodging she had managed before purchasing Welbeck Boarding House. Records from that period revealed a troubling pattern. At least 2 tenants there had died suddenly of gastric complaints. Though bodies from that earlier period were never exhumed, police suspected they, too, might have been poisoned. If true, Edith's career as a poisoner extended far beyond what had initially been uncovered. This revelation strengthened the perception that Edith had been practicing her craft for years, quiet, careful, and calculating. Edith's final days. The Court of Appeal reviewed her case but upheld the original verdict. Edith remained on death row at Holloway Prison, a facility notorious for holding female prisoners awaiting execution. Reports from prison officials painted her as an unrepentant figure. She read books, knitted, and wrote letters to her sister, but she never confessed. Guards noted her peculiar serenity, as though she believed history would vindicate her. In one of her last letters, Edith wrote, "They paint me as a monster. I am only a woman who carried more than she could bear." On a cold morning in May 1934, Edith Kerrigan was hanged. Witnesses said she remained calm, walking steadily to the gallows. Newspapers across Britain reported the event, some with grim fascination, others with quiet relief that the saga had ended. The public reaction. News of her execution divided the public once more. Some saw justice served, arguing her crimes demanded the ultimate punishment. Others believed hanging an elderly woman was cruel, regardless of her guilt. For many, however, Edith's case left an unsettling imprint. It forced people to confront the idea that ordinary homes, quiet boarding houses, run by seemingly motherly figures, could conceal predatory intent. The case also became a cautionary tale about trust, particularly in transient living arrangements where oversight was minimal. Tenants who had once relied on their landladies for care now looked upon them with suspicion. Forensic legacy. The silent poisoner case had a lasting impact on forensic science in Britain. Toxicologists used it to highlight the importance of systematic post-mortem testing. Before Edith's crimes, sudden illnesses were often written off without question. Afterward, coroners were urged to look more closely at unexplained deaths, especially in group living environments. The trial also underscored the significance of circumstantial evidence. Though no one had seen Edith slip arsenic into food, the pattern of deaths, combined with her writings and possession of poison, built a compelling case. In legal circles, the Kerrigan trial became a study in how behavior, motive, and science could combine to reveal hidden crimes. Cultural memory. Though Edith Kerrigan's story never reached the infamy of other British poisoners like Mary Ann Cotton or Florence Maybrick, it endured in quieter corners of true crime history. Local newspapers periodically revisited the case, often framing it as a grim curiosity of the interwar years. In later decades, criminologists placed her within a troubling pattern of female poisoners, women who weaponized domestic trust. Her crimes lacked the drama of violent outbursts, but they revealed something more chilling, a patience that allowed her to kill slowly, invisibly, and repeatedly. The boarding house's shadow. After Edith's execution, Welbeck Boarding House struggled to attract tenants. Despite new management, its reputation was tainted. Locals whispered of the house of poison, and families warned their children to steer clear. Eventually, the property was sold and repurposed, but stories lingered long after the building itself was gone. Residents who survived Edith's reign carried the weight for the rest of their lives. Thomas Riley, the tenant whose testimony about the poisoned cats sealed her fate, rarely spoke publicly about the case. But in one later interview, he admitted, "I never trusted a meal cooked by another person again."